Okay, welcome everyone to Future Work Scotland. Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us for our May edition. We were just joking, I say joking, but commenting on the dreadful weather we're having at the moment, I think in Edinburgh and in Wales, where Nia is based. So if this is your first time, very warm welcome to you. If you've been with us before, warm welcome back. This is our May edition. After this one, we'll talk at the end. We are going to take a little bit of a summer break. If you haven't been here before, I'm Sathpal Singh. I'm your host. I'm joined by my co-host, co-organizer, Donald Henderson. Just the usual formalities. We have a very simple code of conduct. We just ask that you're respectful to one another and everyone have a fantastic time. And Nia's happy to take questions as we go. So if you do have questions that come up for you, pop them in the chat, prefix them with a Q so we can all spot them, and we'll take them as we go, as we're going through the content. And we should still have plenty of time at the end for some questions. So all good there, and we'll do our usual sort of announcements, etc., with some of the things that are coming up at the end. With that, I'm thrilled to welcome Nia Thomas to Future Work Scotland for lots of reasons, not least because Nia's actually been an attendee a number of times for our sessions over the years. So she's a great member of an active member of our community. She supported what we've been doing through this meetup group. She's also got a fantastic podcast herself, Knowing Self, Knowing Others, which she invited Donald and I to come and speak on before. So we've built up a bit of a relationship over the last few years. Nia is currently a director for a children's charity. She's got extensive experience in what she does, some 25 years worth, and she's built up a real interest in leadership, self-awareness, how these kind of come together, how they complement one another, and it's a subject I'm also fascinated by myself. And also, as you probably know, she's the author of this, which you can hopefully see through my blurred screen, this new book. Donald's probably got a copy there too, which I just finished, and it's a great read. And tonight's topic, we will explore some of the core ideas of Nia's new book. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's a fantastic topic, very close to our hearts at Future World Scotland. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nia. Welcome.
Thank you very much. What a lovely, lovely welcome. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining across the globe. Let me start by sharing my screen and we can go forward with our presentation. So, let me make sure that that is going to work for all of us. Can I have some nods around the room? Wonderful. So you can see what I can see. That's brilliant. So, hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to join you today in the Future of Work Scotland. And yes, as Sathpal has already said, I've been a fan for quite some time. So if you want to join me on my website, there's a QR code there. So please do feel free to click. So I'm going to ask you a question to think about before we begin. So it's a question that I want to pose, and we're going to come back to this question in a few minutes. But I wanted to put it out there for you to think about, consider, percolate on, and get ready for when I will ask you this question in a little while. So the question is, what is self-awareness? So I'll leave that question with you and be ready to raise your hand or come off mute and share your answers in the chat. But for now, let me start by giving you a proper introduction to myself. So, as Sathpal has already said, I'm Nia Thomas. And when people ask me what I do, I answer in two parts. So, firstly, what I do is I'm a director in a children's charity. And I have a background in the National Health Service in Wales and England. I've worked in local government and the Department of Health and Social Care. And I moved to the charitable sector about 2 years ago. But for the last 18 or so years, I've been working in the area of babies, children, and family support. Now, the second part of my answer is how I do that is through self-aware leadership. In 2021, I completed my doctorate in what I now call self-aware leadership. It wasn't what I called it back then. And through my studies, I referred to it as self-awareness and leader effectiveness. But over time, it's really morphed to being more of a catchy term, which I call self-aware leadership. When I'd finished my thesis, it took a long time to get my oral exam in the diary. So the way that I started to revise for that oral exam was through blogging. And it was about translating that academic language of my thesis into a more conversational language to really get me ready to talk about my research in an oral exam. And it was also a diversion that kept me occupied and helped me get through the COVID lockdowns. I always knew that I wanted to write a book, but I couldn't really work out how to translate my whole doctoral thesis into a more accessible business book. So, as a way of keeping self-aware leadership alive and raising awareness of awareness, I started a podcast, which Sathpal mentioned earlier, the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. And in episode 3, Sathpal and Donald joined me, and it was really good to have that conversation early on. Then in 2023, after a little while of looking, I found a really good book coach, Steph Caswell, if any of you are looking for one. And she helped me pin down the ideas and the thoughts and helped me structure a business book. And I also had the added benefit of having a year's worth of podcast interviews to draw from to give me those real life examples. And you've already seen the covers of my book in 2 of the windows. So, why do I do all of this? So, it's about developing self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful, and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition, and regulation, which is why it's really interesting for me to see where everybody's coming from across the globe this evening to our webinar. So, let's jump into the superhighway and get on with our learning journey. Get the slides on them. So what journey is our webinar going to be taking today? So we're going to start with why are you here, traveller? And we'll talk about why self-aware leadership, what it is, and we'll get to understand why it's important to you. Then we'll move on to where are you going? And if you're on the superhighway, standing still isn't an option. You always have to be moving to somewhere or other. But one thing I should be absolutely clear about is that self-awareness isn't a destination. So it's not a journey to self-awareness, it's a journey of self-awareness. And it's an ongoing, lifelong journey. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this webinar this evening. Then we finish up by talking about how will you get there. And I'll share with you some of the tests, tools, and techniques of how you can build your self-awareness skills. And maybe you can share some learning and some tests and tools that you use in your organizations. Please do feel free to ask me any questions as we go through, because what I find is that if we ask questions, it really helps make the conversation rich and it helps to ensure that there is learning across the whole group. So Donald and Sathpal are going to keep an eye on hands up, and we will make sure that everybody has an opportunity to share anything that they want to throughout the session. So let's start with part 1. Why are you here, traveller? And I'm often asked about why a self-awareness superhighway and what is it? Well, I've got a vision that a superhighway is something bigger, faster, and higher above the ground than a normal road. I recently read Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers, and she talks about an elevated perspective. And I really wish I'd read that book before I'd written mine, because that's exactly what it is. It's a superhighway that gives you that elevated perspective that allows you to see things and reflect on things in a different way than if you just have your head down, drive along the busy streets, watching out for other road users, pedestrians and hazards, etc. So when you're just journeying along the ordinary busy street, you really don't have that opportunity to achieve that elevated position. So what I aim to give to you is the knowledge, information, and tools to chart your own journey along your own superhighway. And my view of a superhighway is a road that's above the trees that can see down to the city, down to the country. Your superhighway might be different. So the place that you might access your thoughts and your information might be when you're canoeing out in the sea, or it might be when you are walking in the woods. So your superhighway might look different to mine, and that's absolutely fine. So let's move on to defining self-aware leadership. So this notion of self-awareness has been around since the days of Plato and philosophers from 500 BC. And we've probably all heard the phrase know thyself, which seems to be one of the foundational descriptors of self-awareness. But we might not think of that phrase, think of the phrases that we use in our daily lives as being related to self-awareness. So here are just a few of those. So it's get a taste of your own medicine. What goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And I can't resist whenever I read this song, it plays in my mind. I'll be watching you, every move you make, every step you take. I'll be watching you from the Police. And I'm sure lots of you know this song. But why do I draw on those particular phrases and that song specifically? Well, for me, they really embody my definition of self-awareness because it's as much about knowing ourselves on the inside as it is about knowing ourselves on the outside. So we are back to this question. And I hope you've all had a chance to have a think and you're ready to share your thoughts. So I'm going to open that question to the room. What is self-awareness? Any ideas? Please do shout. Anything in the chat, Sathpal? Not yet.
Nothing at the moment, yeah, no, not yet.
Okay.
Only
If
reflecting on your
every
question.
still reflecting, and that's okay. If you have some ideas about what self-awareness is as we go through, please do share because we can always come back and have a conversation. So, what is self-awareness? I can tell you what I think self-awareness is.
So
So,
there's a
the
few things coming up now that I can see if you want me to go through them momentarily.
wonderful. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
no. Right, let me do that. My view today is slightly different due to the tech, but it should be okay. So I've got Dell, if I got that right. The ability to pause. Oh, still scrolling. Ability to pause and define your thoughts and feelings and later reflect on that for improvement. Oh, that's nice.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that idea of that pause. Because often when we're in stressful situations, we don't have that pause and we don't give ourselves that pause.
Hmm. Patrick says, how do I interact with others? Am I being effective? Are there other ways I'm interacting that I'm not aware of? That's nice.
Oh, yes, that
Intending my
blind spot.
effectiveness. Yes. How can I remove those impediments? Lovely. Chris says, being accountable for your actions.
Absolutely. That is
And
definitely when we're thinking about leadership, that's really important.
Carol's added, understanding yourself, reactions, emotions, and how they impact others.
Very interesting that you mentioned emotions there, Carol. Something that I identified in my study was this relationship between self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And there's two different schools of thought that self-awareness contains emotional intelligence and that emotional intelligence contains self-awareness. And they are inextricably linked. Because you have to understand self-awareness, you have to understand your emotions, you have to be able to regulate your emotions in order to be able to develop positive relationships with others. So that's really interesting. So, in terms of defining self-awareness, the first part of a doctoral study is to do a literature review and to find out what other academics and scholars are saying about, for me, self-awareness and self-aware leadership, particularly. And I discovered that in the main, they were defining self-awareness as having an inward-looking element and an outward-looking element. They've had different names through the 20th century, these two different elements, but the most recent one that I could find was internal self-awareness and external self-awareness, which there are groups of studies called the self-other rating studies. So if you're more interested in the academic side of this, I would definitely suggest you head over to Google Scholar and have a look at the self-others ratings studies. And the study that I suggest you have a look at is Atwater and Yamarino. All of the other studies will reference this one, and this one seems to be the foundational study that first started talking about this self-other ratings method of study. And subsequent studies have really tried to prove or disprove what Atwater and Yamarino started. But what I discovered was that external self-awareness seemed to be described differently by different scholars. Some would refer to an external self-awareness as being very close to internal self-awareness, and some would refer to it as being more distant and more separate. So I started grouping these studies, and I found that actually external self-awareness has this connecting part in the middle to internal self-awareness. So this is what I arrived at, and this is my academic definition. So the internal layer is an ability to recognize the self's hard skills and relational skills through reflection and introspection. That's the very center. Then you move out to this joining part, which I describe as an ability to recognize how the self's hard skills and relational skills are received, perceived, and impact others. And then you have this furthest external part, which is an ability to respond and regulate the self's hard skills and relational skills. Now, that's all well and good when we're talking in academic circles, but actually, how do we move that into a more helpful business as usual definition? And because I've been looking to move to this less academic definition, where I am now at is describing self-aware leadership as reflection of your hard and relational skills, recognition of your impact, and regulation of your behavior. So this is what my 3-layer definition looks like: that reflection at the center, recognition at that joining part, and regulation right at the very furthest reaches. So we've gone from this 2-layer definition to the 3-layer definition. But you'll notice that I use the terms hard and relational skills. So let's talk a little bit about relational skills and why I use that term. So through my research, I discovered that there's a very clear distinction between hard skills and soft skills, which is more commonly used, and those emotional skills that fit underneath soft skills. Hard skills are referred to as first order knowledge, which is what I call the what skills. Then there's the soft skills that are, I think they are far more difficult to acquire and master, if we ever do master them at all. So after some consultation with others, relational skills seem to be the most appropriate descriptor of what I was trying to describe. So when I'm referring to soft skills, I refer to them as relational skills. So these second order knowledge, I refer to them as the how skills. So you have the what as the hard technical, and you have the how as the relational. So if I take you back to the very beginning of our webinar, when I described myself as what I do, being a director of a children's charity, and how I do it as through self-aware leadership, I wanted to share an idea of some reflective practice that I can leave with you to think about: what do you do and how do you do it? So maybe you're an accountant that does their work with specificity and respect. You might be a social worker and you do your work through care and collaboration. If you are happy to share, and if you come up with a description that you're happy with in terms of your what and your how, then please, we will come back and share those at the end, and feel free to put that in the chat or to come off chat. But why is any of this important to you? Well, your relationships with other people determine whether you're effective in your role, whether you're effective as a leader, and whether your organization is effective. So whether you're a solopreneur or whether you work in an organization of 10,000 people, relationships are important. And in an era where we're moving towards what I tend to call as hyperhumanism on one side of the scale and intense digitization on the other, your ability to build relationships with every person you come into contact with is going to become increasingly more important. So let me take a pause there to see if anybody's got any questions or any thoughts that they would like to share.
Nothing in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and get clarification, then please feel free. I think you might be all good for now.
So let's move on to the second part. So let's talk about the critical behaviors of self-awareness. And I've put those together in a self-awareness compass. So all of these elements are elements that were drawn out through the research. So I carried out a questionnaire and interviewed a number of different individuals. And all of these elements of the compass were things that came out. I'm also going to have a conversation with you about signposts and directions, which are the positive elements that need to wrap around you essentially in organizations to enable you to be effective. And of course, the roadblocks and trip hazards, which try to obstruct you on that journey. So, this is my self-awareness compass. Each of the direction points were developed through my research, as I mentioned. So, let me share each of them with you. So, we have care, humility, authenticity, reflection, trust, adaptability, behavior, learning, and experience. So let's take a few of these and discuss them a little bit further. Let's start by talking about care. So, as self-aware leaders, demonstrating care is really important because care humanizes your role along with authenticity and some other of those directions. And it makes you more accessible to your people. So, care is not unidirectional. Care is about taking care of yourself as well as taking care of others. And we know that people in leadership positions model the behavior that others follow. So if a leader stops to take lunch every day, then it models self-care and gives that tacit permission for other people to do that the same. So that element of care for self, care for others, we model that as leaders. There's an interesting conversation that I often hear being aired about employees versus customers. Um, and I think it's Richard Branson who said that if you look after your people will look after your customers. And you'll have other organizations who behave as if their employees don't matter at all and that customers can be as abusive to staff as they want and that the organization will always side with the customer. So you need to really be mindful of the values of your organization in making the decision whether you're an employee centric or customer centric organization or whether you aim to have this balance of both. Now, caring doesn't mean shying away from having difficult conversations. If you want to be a leader and a manager who cares for their people, you need to be able to give respectful feedback, be empathic, and care for them as a human being. It would be great if anybody has any examples of colleagues that they've worked with, whether that's managers or direct reports, that have either demonstrated care or a lack of care that they want to share. It'd be great to hear any stories that you have. By all means, put it in the chat or come off mute. If you think of anything, we can come back to it at the end. Let's talk about trust. So trust is an interesting one. And I include it as a behavior, but of course, being trustworthy is a whole raft of different behaviors because you can't simply choose to be trustworthy. That's something that others choose of you. But if you try to demonstrate that trust, whether you are trustworthy is most definitely decided by others. And I've tried to capture the various things that makes someone trustworthy, whether that's through the research or through conversations that I've had with others, or even conversations on my podcast. Consistency, I think, is quite interesting. I spoke to Dan Pontefract, I'm sure some of you will have heard of on my podcast. And in his book, Work Life Bloom, he describes being consistent as something that creates that sense of trust. And I tend to refer to it as bandwidth above and below a line of standard norms. So you can be a few standard deviations above or below that line of normal. But if your behavior swings above or below that, people really don't know which version of you they're going to be getting on a particular day. And if they don't know which version of you they're going to get, they don't know whether you are going to be backing them in a particular situation. So authenticity and integrity, I'm sure you hear about these if you are followers of LinkedIn and you're readers of business books. Authenticity, it's not about warts and all. It's about having a really deep understanding of your values and being able to operate and work and behave to your values. Integrity, it links very much with the moral compass. So if you have consistency in your behavior and you operate with integrity and morality most of the time, your team are very likely to know the answers to some of the questions that they're coming to you with. Um, and generally, if your relational skills are consistent, authentic, humble, and you operate with integrity to your moral compass, uh, those things are going to become very transparent to your team and they will have that trust in you. In terms of empowerment, that's about transferring trust to others. So if you want others to see you as trustworthy, you have to be able to demonstrate that to them. And you've probably read Simon Sinek's book or heard the title, Leaders Eat Last. And I think it's about this sense of sharing that trust and being the one that either goes first or the one that goes last, depending on the situation. And your team, your people need to know that they can be empowered, they can operate in a sense that they know that they can mess up with backup. And it's up to you as the leader to be accountable for any failures and to be constructive enough to help somebody move forward into a more positive place. So, even though trust is one of the directions on the self-awareness compass, it's not a single behavior that you can demonstrate. It's lots of different things. And trust is something that your followers or your direct reports or your colleagues instill in you. But the thing about trust is that it can disappear within a blink of an eye. So it takes a very long time to develop, but can disappear very quickly. If anybody would like to share any thoughts on somebody that they've worked with that has demonstrated high trust or very low trust, by all means, come in and share.
Bob's put in the chat, he'd like to share a thought. Yeah, please, Bob. Yeah, feel free.
Yeah. The point about consistency reminds me of I had a report a while ago who told me that that what he appreciated most about working with me is I was actually predictable, and I wonder if predictability matches up to the consistency. And you mentioned people coming to you for a decision or to know what it is. And I always tried to work on that predictability, and and people who work with me ought to know how I operate, and 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 the way I try to do things, and it ought to be pretty clear what a preferred option is based on their knowledge of that.
I really like that. I think you're probably right. We could probably swap the word consistency with predictability. And maybe what we can describe is that it's a bandwidth of predictability. And I think when somebody moves beyond that bandwidth of predictability, that's when the uncertainty arises and trust is maybe not as secure in that individual as it could be or as it should be, especially if you've got a senior leader that you need to rely on. So I really like that word.
Patrick's got his hand up. If you're happy to take another thought before you move on.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Hi,
Patrick.
yeah, thanks so much for having me. And this is great. And yeah, love what you're doing. What you said and talking about trust made me think of the importance of modeling the behaviors that we want others to exhibit. So as a leader, if I expect my team to be a certain way or interact a certain way, one of the best ways to do that is simply you can tell them, hey, I want you to be this way. But if my behavior is not consistent with that suggestion, let's say, then there's going to be cognitive dissonance, or people are going to think you're a hypocrite or whatever. So for me, being self-aware is being aware of like how I want others to treat me, and then I treat others that way. And that modeling the behavior is for me, such a critical part of that equation.
I'm really glad you brought up modeling behavior. So behavior is one of the directions on the self-awareness compass. And you're absolutely right. It feeds into so many of the other directions. Whether we are being humble, we have to model it. Whether we are listening, we have to model we are doing that. And modeling behavior comes up in lots of the conversations I have about self-aware leadership. It seems to be one of those baseline behaviors that really we have to ensure that we are leaning into at every possible opportunity. There's
Right.
an example that I often give, and it's a really good example. I spoke to Dr. Gerrit Peltzer on his podcast, actually, and he referred to a German politician who was hoping to take on the role that Angela Merkel was leaving. And he describes that the Lachette, so the name of the chap was Lachette, and he was viewed in the back of a video shot laughing. So he'd gone to a flooding site, and he was there to support exactly. And I think that was the sort of reaction. And of course, the press took it out of context, and all they saw was this guy laughing. But of course, it could have been totally unrelated. But that is, if we are modeling behavior as leaders, we have to understand that we are being observed on a 360 basis, 24/7 in many cases, such as roles such as politician, they are being observed. And I think if you forget that, it has an implication, because if we are having relationships with others and our behavior goes out, that comes back. So when I started this webinar, I talked about lots of different phrases. So people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and what goes around comes around, and that's absolutely that. So if we model the behavior that we want to see, we are preventing that poor behavior going out into our workplaces and coming back, because eventually they will. So that's absolutely, modeling behavior is really important.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to share, or anything come in the chat, Sathpal?
There's just a comment from Della about feeling positive about, by the end of the 9 points, I'm going to be able to identify direct examples of what my line manager does in her approach to leading our team. I'd be curious to know whether she has built on these skills, relational skills that you're talking about. That's really good. Over time, or whether she just leads like this from the gut. In all probability, it will probably be the former.
Interesting. Well, we will come back to a tool that might help you at the end. So if you want to talk more about that when we get to the end, you're very welcome to. So let's move on to experience. And I like to talk about experience because it's a slightly different behavior. So when I talk about experience, what I'm talking about is experiential learning. So to be self-aware leaders both endeavor to generate learning opportunities for themselves, and they are proactive in sharing that learning with other people. And if we view, as we just talked about, regulation of behavior as an important element of self-awareness, then we have to expose people to those learning opportunities to develop their resilience, to make different choices in how they behave, as well as the knowledge and skills about what alternative behaviors they can choose. So if you're a self-aware leader that wants to afford their people with experiential learning, you need to think about how you share that. And that's where storytelling skills comes in. And I think storytelling has really gained a foothold and an importance in the business world over the last 10, 15 years. So, how do you nurture people? How do you tap into your coaching curiosity and your mentoring guidance to be able to provide those opportunities for people out around you? So, in generating experiences for people, you need to consider where their talents lie. And to do that, you have to have care, you have to listen, you have to be authentic, and all of those other behaviors of the self-awareness compass. But what it also means is that you need to help them to develop their self-awareness skills to be able to share with you what their talents, their strengths, and their interests are, to encourage them to create the most to create the most out of those nurturing opportunities that you're providing. So, are there any examples that anybody has in the room of experiences or experiential learning, either that you have actively put in place for yourself, or that you actively put in place for the people around you?
I could add one of the best managers I ever had was a storyteller, and
Okay.
he would actually um, tell you what to do, what he wanted you to do by telling you a story about the requirement, at the end of which it was really obvious that what I had to do to resolve it. And so he wasn't actually asking me to do anything. I was actually saying, yeah, I need to do that in order to fix it. And by creating all the backstory and all the rest, I had a complete picture of why I was actually doing it, what I needed to do, and I was also learning about why I would carry out a particular action in a particular situation, and I just thought that was a really powerful kind of a management tool.
That really is a skill, isn't it? Being able to tell a story without
Yeah.
directing anybody, but helping
Yes.
them to move to a position where they know what to do. I think
Yes.
that really is mentoring, coaching, nurturing, and storytelling all together in one individual. And those are the people that we'd like to bottle so that we could keep those skills
That's
and
right.
share them out with others.
Yeah.
If anybody else would like to share, we will move forward. So I talked to you about signposts and directions and roadblocks and trip hazards. As I progressed through my research, there were really different guides and obstructions emerging. And within signposts and directions that enable us to operate as self-aware leaders in organizations, we need to have effective strategy, organizational standards, recruitment, people performance. When we're talking about effective strategy, which the organization lives and breathes, I had a podcast with Tessa Clark, the CEO of Olio, the food sharing app, just this week. And she recruits for mission obsession. And I was just wondering whether there were anybody on the webinar today. Does your organization talk about mission obsession? Do you talk about strategic objectives? Do you talk about the values of the organization to the point where everybody knows them, everybody can talk about them? But do they also model that behavior of living to those values? Organizational standards are about upholding standards of conduct, and I tend to think of capability as can't cook and conduct as won't cook. So it's that behavioral element. If you have an organizational strategy that talks about operating with integrity, but individuals are often ignoring the procurement policy and giving contracts to their sister-in-law's company, that's not self-aware leadership, and that's simply ignoring organizational standards. Organizational standards link very closely with behavior modeling. And I tend to think of behavior modeling as what we do as individuals, and organizational standards are what we do as an organization wide. So it's essentially the behavior modeling demonstrated by the organization. Going live next week is a conversation with Matt Dunsmore, and we talked about recruitment, and not only the internal process of recruitment, but where do you seek out potential candidates in the first place? Matt says that if you keep going to the same universities, you're going to keep employing people who have been taught by the same professors, which makes it far less likely that you'll have diverse candidates. And we know that less diverse teams are less effective at problem solving. So recruitment, as I often say, recruitment has a lot to answer for. In terms of the recruitment, the internal processes, there are some organizations that are really demonstrating innovative ways of recruiting. So I've heard of an organization that considers interviews more as auditions, and they will allow individuals to present or to demonstrate the values of their organization in whatever way they choose and whatever way they see fit. And that not only tells them about what an individual can do, but how they do it. In terms of roadblocks and trip hazards, strategic level disconnect really came through my research loud and clear. And it describes this chasm between those at the most strategic level of organizations and those providing direct customer or client or patient services. And what did become clear was that inclusive decision making is a mitigator against that. So something that we focus heavily on in my charity is co-production between organizational officers and parents as a mitigator against strategic level disconnect. And I think it's more challenging in organizations that are hierarchical and they are larger, because it generally means that there are lots of layers between the individuals at the C-suite or your executive and what happens at the very grassroots of their organization. So they have to be even more tuned in to what's happening at the grassroots of their organization to ensure that there isn't this strategic level disconnect. Red tape and bureaucracy is a roadblock to expediency and efficiency, and public sector organizations, which is the organizations that I was mainly interested in my research, they're generally viewed as bureaucratic and slow and hierarchical. But what I did discover is that even in those organizations, individuals are working with and around those systems to be able to move in a more agile way. Then we have stress, and that's something that we've mentioned earlier. And stress means that individuals are more likely to be operating at the inner circle of the self-awareness compass. So if you think about the compass that we've already seen, the directions are right at the very outer rim. And I'll tell you a little bit more as we go further. There are scoring elements between the center of the circle and the outer circle. And what we want is to move towards the outer element of that circle to demonstrate that we are operating in as many of those 9 directions as we possibly can. If we are under stress, we work right at the very center of that self-awareness compass. So if we're in fight or flight, we won't have that reflection, recognition, and regulation time or headspace to journey outwards towards those 9 essential directions, because we're just fighting to keep our heads above water and the wolf from the door. Accidental leaders, there is it's an interesting concept, and it's a descriptor that I'm hearing more frequently now, and more people that I'm speaking to are familiar with this idea of accidental leaders. Accidental leaders for me are generally those technical, first order knowledge, hard skills experts who, because of their level of skills, have been allocated a team to manage. And in my podcast with Sophie Bryan, Carly Cannings, and I think actually Sathpal, you mentioned it when you joined me on the podcast, talked about accidental leaders. And they talked about people with really high technical skills being assumed to have good people skills, because of course that's what happens when you get very good at a technical skill. Somebody hands a team to you and says, manage the team. But it's often that people with highly technical skills don't want to manage people, or maybe they don't have those skills to manage people. But it's really worth listening to Sophie Bryan's episode, because you'll hear her talking about her husband as someone who was in exactly that situation. He was highly technical, and the organization said, here, have a team to manage. And he identified that it wasn't his skill set, and he got to the point where he left the organization. But check in with that episode to hear more of that. So, are there any thoughts around the signposts and directions and roadblocks and trip hazards that anybody would like to share, either because you are living them, or because you have experienced them, or you've experienced changes in behavior of others who maybe have been under particular stress in a particular instance?
I had a thought on the accidental leaders one, because I used to work in electrical engineering and I moved into IT. So there was always an issue of highly technical people who were trying to move up without taking on teams, because they are technical individuals, not managers, which, as you know, is an entirely different skill set. And one organization I was in actually had two parallel paths. You could actually progress purely as a highly qualified technical individual without taking on management of a team, which is pretty unusual, I believe, and quite innovative.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that very innovative. And actually, in my podcast episode with Sophie Bryan, she says that we really need to think about separating out those skills of hard skills and relational skills within the workplace, because it isn't necessary that you may have, if you're people skilled, that you will have technical, or if you're technical, you have people skills. And we do know, I think that it was the Chartered Management Institute, I was hearing them say that there are around 80 or so % of people who take on management roles who have not had management training. So even if you are a technical person who's thinking about moving up and doesn't necessarily know what that might mean in terms of people leadership, it's highly likely that you won't have any training before you get there. And you may have to just work it out to decide whether it's something for you or it's not for you. Would anybody else like to come in or share any thoughts?
I have a thought, if I may.
Absolutely.
Apologies for my camera. I'm really not camera ready today.
That's all right.
Thank you. I really align very deeply with the left-hand side of the screen that you're currently showing in your slide share. I think I do come from a company that has a lot more freedom to make decisions and to try experiments. And speaking to the recruitment item, we had a challenge in our team. We're a team of, I would sort of call them in the agile environment, Scrum Masters mostly, where we needed to recruit new Scrum Masters, but we weren't being very successful in the market. And so the team was actually offered the opportunity to come up with a plan, which I really appreciated. And we then decided we very much, as a company, employ from within the company. We try to upskill and recruit people from various aspects and elements of the company, and different departments, and then try to hire somebody and then upskill in that skill set, which was very interesting because for a Scrum Master, if you think about it, we weren't even looking for somebody to have a certification. We were just looking for individuals with the X factor, if I can put it that way. And we landed up hiring two exceptional humans. But what we did was a very interesting hiring process, which speaks similarly to your audition style that you were speaking of earlier. So we allowed the opportunity for them to present themselves as in a normal interview situation, but then thereafter presented them with case studies that they then had to sort of like navigate. And we found exceptional humans who then, after that, followed the pathway to becoming certified Scrum Masters. So I really resonated really nicely with that aspect.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the recruitment process is a real challenge because there are organizations that are trying different ways, but I'm not hearing something very radical in terms of recruitment. So if anybody's heard of a radical recruitment method, please do drop me a line because I'd really be interested in hearing about that. Because if we are talking about behavior modeling and recruiting for mission obsession, as Tessa Clark refers to it, we have to start from the place of recruitment. And I'm not sure that we have really considered different methods of recruitment because it's generally you put your advert out, you apply, and then you sit in an interview with 2 or 3 people in front of you. So I think, as you explained there, Della, there are very few organizations taking this more innovative approach. So please do connect with me and let me know if you're hearing of something more of an innovative in that recruitment space. Would anybody else like to share? Sathpal, is there anything that you would like to mention about accidental leaders? Because I'm conscious that you started your working career within a technical space and then moved on to managing people.
Oh, you put me on the spot there. We did talk
Absolutely.
about it in your podcast. I put it in the chat actually, just that it was, I originally came by it through my relationship with the CMI. So I did their charter manager program, which I know you did too. But you're absolutely right. I think the only point I would make is I think it's being conscious that when we move out of technical specialisms into managerial roles and leadership roles, often people are not equipped. And that was one of the things I identified early on and was keen to ensure that I wasn't also one of those individuals. So I've done a lot of leadership training, management training, and it makes a big difference because you've got to be equipped with the right tools to be able to do those roles. And people get promoted because, there'll be, salary caps, there'll be, a multitude of reasons. But there's a lot required in certainly the modern workplace from managers and certainly leaders. And if you're going to be doing it, you should be supported to do it well or learn how to do it, is probably the point I would make.
And that's a really good example of experiential learning, that you went out and sought that learning because you had identified that you had a gap. So for me, that suggests you had that self-awareness to understand what your strengths and weaknesses were. You went out to seek that experiential learning and you acted on that. So I think that gives us lots of different examples of lots of different elements of the self-awareness compass. Any other thoughts before we move into part 3?
Just to say that, Sathpal, you're a lot more organized and smarter than I am because I dropped into management completely accidentally from purely technical roles, and I've had no training at all. I have just been really lucky to be able to learn from excellent managers over the years.
Model the behavior you want to see. Definitely.
So,
Although, Bob, you are here, which is experiential learning.
well, that's
So
true
that
too.
does demonstrate an element of self-awareness. So you've identified that you haven't had formal training, so you are going out and seeking those experiences elsewhere.
Better late than never.
Let's move to part 3. So now that we know what self-awareness is and we know what self-aware leadership, we know which directions we need to travel, but how might we get there? So let's talk about tests, tools, and techniques that can help you to develop your self-awareness. So something that I was asked about a lot when I started talking about self-awareness was, well, how do I become self-aware? So over the last year, 18 months, every time I have a conversation with somebody and they suggest a method of developing self-awareness, I write it down and I take a note. And this is just part of the list that I've developed. And you can read more in my book if you're interested in those test tools. But mindfulness and meditation, I often suggest that people start here, particularly if you're new to self-awareness, because what you may not want to do is to launch straight into seeking feedback or to do a 360-degree review. Start by just understanding yourself. So when we think about stress and we think about behaviors and we think about our response to different stimuli, it often has a very physical impact on us. It changes your heart rate, it changes your breathing. And if you want to become self-aware, you need to understand the impact of all of those extraneous influences on you and your body, that metaphysical impact that it has on you. So start with mindfulness and meditation. You don't need any tools. You just need to be in a safe space where you can take time to breathe. It might be 2 minutes, it might be 5 minutes, and you might do that for a week. But it's something that you can build on. It's something that you can stop and use wherever you are. You can take 3 breaths before you go into a webinar to deliver a presentation. You can take 5 breaths before you go into a meeting. But that then you can learn a little bit more about yourself and how you operate. Then we have tests, tools, and assessments, and I love these tests, tools, and assessment. If you go to my website and click on blog and search for tests and tools, you'll see a post from, I think it's September 23, and I've included a list of the tests and tools that I have come across over the last few years that I have been researching this. So some tests have been developed with rigorous academic testing, some are magazine quizzes, and some are just for fun. What I do suggest is to keep revisiting these tools because no tool is a panacea. And being that self-awareness is a journey and it's impacted by births, deaths, marriages, moving house, who we work with, changing of jobs, and other life experiences, we change. So our answers today might not be the same answers that we give in 5 years' time. So just because you complete one test on one occasion doesn't mean that tomorrow you will be self-aware. It means that your blind spot, your awareness blind spot, will be reduced for a little period, and then something else will happen in your life and you will want to revisit it. Journaling is becoming increasingly more popular. And if you listen to my conversation with Andrew Bryant on my podcast, he talks about how reading back his journaled thoughts helped him to change his perspective. So he talked to me about he'd made the decision to give up alcohol, and his self-talk was telling him, "I'm giving something up." But when he journals that, what he said was he discovered that actually these were all the benefits that he was going to derive. There was weight loss, he would feel better, his stomach would feel better, and all of those kind of things. So by sharing those thoughts onto the page, he was able to read those back and to change his perspective. I've also got an accompanying journal as part of my book that allows you to score yourself against the 9 directions of the self-awareness compass. So as I mentioned earlier, you saw the compass with the directions on the outer elements. There are 9 scoring points from the center to the outer edge of the compass. And as I mentioned, when you're under stress, you're working in the center. What we want to do with our discovery of self-awareness is to move out towards the outer edge of that self-awareness compass. Coaching and mentoring. We've already mentioned briefly mentoring when Bob was talking about that manager who was very effective storyteller. Coaching and mentoring are gaining popularity, and I think even as managers who are managers of people, you don't need to do a specialized coaching course to understand how you can ask more open questions, do more listening, to be take a more coaching approach with your direct reports. I think mentoring is something that we need to choose our mentors carefully, because we need to ensure that they are taking our best interest and they are providing us with really rich, useful, helpful, and accurate information to be able to support us and nurture us to move forward. Feedback is interesting. If you're a senior leader, feedback is not always easy. Sometimes organizations will carry out a 360-degree review, which are very helpful. But if you're considering feedback that's more business as usual, more conversational, you also need to think carefully about who you're asking that feedback of. So filtered feedback is a challenge for leaders, and it's something that often comes up through my research and conversations, because you need to be proactive in reducing any change of that filtration. So as a leader, we know that we have significant influence and power over different individuals in our organization. And if we seek feedback, there is a potential that that feedback comes back to us as flowers and roses and everything's wonderful. But what you want is to get to the real nub of the feedback. And what I like to do is to seek feed forward. And feed forward gives you something more tangible. So it's asking questions like, why, what would you like me to do more of? What would you like me to do less of? What can I do differently? And this gives you something more constructive, because I think if we think about feedback, it's often about something that's been and that you cannot change. So the webinar that you presented was really ineffective. You spoke too quickly. You went through your PowerPoint presentation too quickly. What can you do with that other than mull on something that you've done and you have no power to change? However, if you seek feed forward, what responses you will get is, next time you do a presentation, speak a little slower and go through your slides a little bit slower, which is far more constructive, it's more proactive, and it's positive focused. So if you are somebody who is a little bit more confident in seeking to build your self-awareness skills, feedback using a feed-forward mechanism is a really effective way of doing that. And I do that very simply. So I will pose 3 questions to my team. What would you like me to do more of? What would you like me to do less of? What can I do differently? And I use an anonymous survey to gather their thoughts. And then I collect all of those, and they form part of my professional development plan, because I can change what I do next. So it's about having that constructive feedback to make the choices about regulating my behavior. So if you think back to the definition of self-awareness, it's reflection of your hard and relational skills, recognition of your impact, and regulation of your behavior. So if you have constructive feedback, you are able to make positive choices about your behavior. Then there are 360-degree reviews, and done well, I think 360s are particularly valuable. However, you need to be sure that your organization is administering 360s in the most effective way. If the subject about which the 360 is being undertaken is too close to those individuals who are doing the scoring, so that might be the line manager, colleagues, or direct reports, that will create this filtered feedback that we've just talked about. So you have to ensure that you have separation between the subject and the individuals who are creating that rating. Which takes me on to the Self-Awareness Compass quiz. So in the spirit of 360-degree reviews, I developed a Self-Awareness Compass quiz that allows you to score yourself against all of those 9 points of the compass. So if you remember when I described that, if you think of all of those 9 points of the self-awareness compass, there are scoring points towards each of those directions. You can then, once you have scored yourself, you can then email it on to up to 3 friends, family, or colleagues and ask them to assess you against the same points. The final chart will show you your scores and the average of their scores inputted by your other individuals. So it ensures that you have that separation, it ensures that anonymity, and you have an aggregate score from all of those individuals. So this is the type of chart that you'll receive. So for example, if you consider the self is the white line, that's me, and the other is the average scores of the 3 individuals that I sent my request to. So people think I'm far more trustworthy than I think of myself, and that's a good thing. Other people consider that I seek to share experiences, that I'm humble, and to about the same degree as I think of myself. But the distance between my score on behavior and others' score on behavior makes me want to find out a bit more about that. And that is the one direction that I need to get curious about. So when Bob was sharing his experience earlier, we talked about maybe wanting to move more in one direction than another. And this chart will give you that map of direction. So for me, in terms of this chart that has been created, I need to explore with maybe my line manager or my coach or my trusted colleague, or maybe to put out a feed forward survey about being transparent about your findings and being humble as well as curious in wanting to improve in that direction. So you need to think about what behavior modeling means to you. You need to explore it, and you probably need to have more examples from your colleagues about what are they seeing, what are they experiencing, which might be different to you. So in terms of your results and your scores on your self-awareness compass quiz, it's those differences between your ratings and your other ratings that are really important. And those are the elements that show you the difference between your self-awareness and how others are seeing you. So if you go to my website, you can access this for free. I'm hoping to create an app in the future, but that's something on the to-do list. So before I round up, I wanted to come back to the idea that we talked about earlier, what you do and how you do it. So if anybody would like to share any of their answers that they've reflected on since we've been having our conversation, please do share. So I asked you to describe what you do and how you do it. So if you have any thoughts, please come off mute. Please do share in the chat.
Just while folk are thinking and maybe contributing in the chat or wanting to chip in, I shared your link to your quiz on the site a
Brilliant.
couple of times early on, and again now, not least because I came by it at the end of your book and I didn't know you had that. And I've already started to think about doing it, and I'm going to do it. And I've also asked three of my colleagues who've worked under my leadership at different points to do the second part where they get asked to do the same thing. So just to
Amazing.
see what comes up.
Very interesting. Yes, and if anybody does the quiz and they'd like to share with me or they want to feed back about any of their findings or even using the quiz, then please do come back to me. It's really interesting to understand how people are discovering their self-awareness and the things they're discovering about themselves. So if anybody else would like to share, you're very welcome. So the question was, what do you do and how do you do it?
I was quite late to the call, I'm afraid, and I missed the first part of it. So what we do and how we do it, just as a very general.
So let me recap very briefly for you, Bob. When I'm asked what I do, I often describe it in two parts. So firstly, I'm a director of a children's charity. That's what I do. And how I do it is self-aware leadership because I've had the benefit of studying. So I use those two descriptors. What I'm very interested in is our own reflective practice and our own brand of leadership. How do we explain ourselves to others? How do we describe ourselves? And how do we show up for others? So, do we know? I suppose is the first question. And have we had an opportunity to reflect? And therefore, are we able to articulate it? Because I think if we are looking to be self-aware leaders, we need to know what brand we are trying to create. So I can explain to others the self-awareness is reflection, recognition, regulation, and the 9 points of the self-awareness compass if they want to know more about how I do my leadership. So I'm interested in understanding whether other people in the webinar are also at that position, would they be able to describe what they do and how they do it? So I gave the example of a social worker. So that's what you do, but how you do it might be in collaboration with others and caring for others. Or it might be that you're an accountant and you do that with specificity and you do it with respect. So those are those two values. They're your determination about your brand. They're that behavior that you're putting out into the world, and that's what you want to be as a self-aware leader. So if anybody's got any thoughts, please do share, either come off mute or share in the chat.
I'll have a crack at it.
Go.
I do transformational change in ICT, and the way I do it is I hold a vision, and I try to get people to participate in and become enthusiastic about contributing to the the achievement of the vision.
I like that. So we've got your hard skills, your hard element there, your technical side, and participatory, inclusive, visionary, lots of different elements there. I'd be really interested if everybody on the call, if you are working with other colleagues, ask that question of them and come back and share. You'll find me on LinkedIn, you'll find me on Substack. If you go to my website, you'll find me. But I'd really like to know whether colleagues were able to do that, whether it took some time and some thinking, and did you all learn a little bit about each other just by asking that question, that being a little bit curious? So this is my book and my journal. If you'd like to get your own copy, they are available on Amazon, but I would really like to support the high street. So if you have a high street bookstore near you that sells the book, please do order it from them. And it was just lovely to see Sathpal and Donald sharing their copies at the beginning of the webinar. This is my podcast. I've mentioned a few episodes through the webinar today. If you listen, please do feedback, because I'd love to hear your views about the things that we discuss. So all of my podcasts are guest and interview based. So we always talk about elements of self-awareness, whether it's bullying and harassment, whether it's culture change, whether it's leadership in the National Health Service or in a corporate entity. We always bring it back to self-awareness. You can find the audio on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and lots of other wonderful podcast players. And you can also watch the videos on YouTube. This is my website. This is how you can get in touch with me, and you can access all of my social media. So whether it's LinkedIn, newsletters on Substack, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, you can access them all via my website. And in the spirit of increasing my self-awareness, your feedback is really important. So please grab your phones, please take a shot of the QR code and share your feedback or your feed forward. So I will open it up to questions, and I'll hand back to you, Sath, to chair those questions.
Thanks. Yeah, that was great. Really enjoyed that, actually. And thanks everyone for their contributions and participation. It really makes it a very rich learning experience for us all. There's not many other questions I can see. I did see, I think Della shared a response to your question, but I think it went to me directly, which I'm assuming was just an error. So I'm happy to share that if Della's happy for me to share that. I can't see Della because it's just my layout.
Yeah, please
So
go ahead and share. Apologies, I was not paying attention to everybody.
No, that's all right. It's okay. I do that all the time. You happy for me to share? Good for Nia to hear it. Yeah?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm like keep scrolling through, so I keep losing it. Just quite entertaining. Let me see. There we are. You give it a go. What I do, I help teams deliver quality and value. How do I do it? By building rapport and professional relationships. I call it walking a journey for growth and discovery. That's great.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
That's brilliant, Ella. So if anybody asked you to describe what kind of leader you are, you now have your brand very clear. Love that.
Thank you. That was a tricky question.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does take a little bit of thinking through.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a good answer, actually.
I think
I don't see any.
Patrick has his hand up.
Patrick has his hand up. Missed that. Patrick, sorry. Waiting patiently.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Nia, thank you very much. This was really helpful and great timing for me on my journey. When I was a youth, I played tennis. And when I first started playing, I learned the steps of the various moves, like, say, how to hit a forehand. And so it's like, racket back and bring forward, step into it, transfer the weight. And that's how I learned how to hit a forehand. And then I read a book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which is like a Zen archery approach applied to tennis. And it emphasized the importance of quieting the mind and getting into the flow. And when I focused on the flow, I stopped telling myself what steps to take in hitting the forehands. And I focused on the ball. And then as I continued to focus on the ball, my body responded. And as I got more into the flow and quieted my mind, then my game improved dramatically. It was just off the charts, and it was a lot more enjoyable. And I'm guessing, so that's kind of like a setup here. I'm guessing the more practice one gets in being self-aware, the less one has to remind oneself of what to do moment to moment, or all those various aspects that you described today. So I basically have two questions, if time permitting. To boil it down, is there an analogous approach to self-awareness that involves becoming more intuitive, so one doesn't have to, say, go through all the steps? And can you tell, or maybe with time as it is, could you tell a story of someone who started less self-aware and moved toward greater self-awareness, to serve as an example for us to kind of map onto for our own experience? And thank you for your time and attention.
So interesting about moving towards self-awareness and that practice of self-awareness. I think practicing the hard skills element of self-awareness, you most definitely do improve. And I think you do improve in your ability to receive feedback, because I've spoken to lots of people and feedback can be really tough to hear. But I think the more that you do it, you become less hurt by it and you become more curious about it. And you take it as a learning opportunity in the spirit that it's meant. So I think you do get more adept at using the skills like the backhand or the forehand that you mentioned, but do you become better at being self-aware? As I said, self-awareness is a constant journey. So I think you might be very self-aware today, and then you'll have stresses tomorrow and for the rest of the week, and you are a little bit less self-aware. So I think your self-awareness, that balance is always changing. But if you are conscious of the tools that you can tap into, then it means you are better able to find that space to be able to create that self-awareness. So I think probably the answer to the question is both yes and no. So in terms of somebody who's become self-aware, I think I can probably talk about a colleague that I worked with who was finding it difficult to build relationships with colleagues, and also wasn't always delivering work on time. And they were quite insular in their thinking. So they had a very small, they were an individual in a very small team. And through talking about different concepts of leadership, talking about different concepts around behavior, particularly coming from where I come from, which is self-aware leadership, that individual really took on that. And I tend to consider them as a real sponge. They soaked up all of that learning. And I know that they have developed within their career. They can talk about their own behavior now, which they couldn't before. So they can tell you about their interest in deadlines or their disinterest in deadlines and their interest in new shiny work, and less in the more mundane. So I think I've definitely seen a shift. I saw a shift in that colleague, and yeah, I do like to refer to them as the sponge. But yes, going from that, I operate in to my own frame of reference. But the more I'm understanding about myself and about others, I'm starting to understand how I operate within their frame of reference. So yeah, that was wonderful to watch.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Probably got time for one more question if there is one, and then I'll start to wrap up. We're coming up to time, but happy to take one more if there is. Or any observation or any other comment anybody wants to make on everything that Nia's covered. It's been a great session. Or any final remarks from yourself, Nia?
If anybody has any other thoughts that they'd like to share, you're very welcome to do that on any of the social media platforms that you prefer. Certainly, what we haven't talked about this evening is how introverts reflect versus how extroverts reflect. And we may have a room of introverts or we may have a room of extroverts. And you may go away and have sleep on it for 2 nights and you may have a thought or you may want to share something. Please, by all means, come back to me. That's what we know is self-awareness is really important, that reflection. If you want reflection time and you need reflection time and you suddenly have a light bulb moment at 4 o'clock in the morning, drop me a line. I may not reply at 4 o'clock in the morning, but I definitely will get back to you.
I'm very glad to hear that you're not going to respond to messages at 4 in the morning. That would not be exercising some good self-care. Della, you got your hand up. Was that deliberate or a mistake? Or?
I'd just like to ask if Dr. Nia could kindly share display the QR code again for the feedback. I didn't have my QR reader ready at that point.
Yes, I will do that.
Thank
There,
you.
can you see that, Della?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. I will leave that there for 2 seconds then. Sathpal, back to you.
Yeah, no, great. I think we'll wrap up. We've got a couple of minutes left just for, but yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, we'll leave that up so folk can use it and give you some feedback so you can continue to improve what you're doing, which is fantastic. It was a brilliant session. So thank you for joining us. It's really good to host you. Nice to do it in reverse, and I thoroughly enjoyed your book. So for anyone who wants to delve deeper into the subject, I can't recommend Nia's new book highly enough. I've literally just finished it, and I've even written a review on Amazon. It hasn't appeared yet. We don't quite know what's happening. I think the reviews go through a lengthy review process. Just quite amusing in and of itself. But no, thanks everyone for joining. It has been fantastic. You've been great contributors this evening, great participants, and it makes it a healthier session, as I mentioned earlier. After this session, we've got a few others in the schedule. We're doing something we haven't done before, so just wanted to call it out because some of you are regulars. Because we've been doing this for 4 years now, I think, since 2019, and we've done sessions every month. And there was a time where we did them fortnightly, and in 2020 we did something every week, and I don't quite know how we did that, but we did. But this year we are taking a break over the summer. So our next session, you'll be surprised to hear those of you who are regulars, and there are a few on the call. Our next one is in August. So look out for that. We're going to have June and July off this year for a number of different reasons. Hopefully you won't hold that against us. But our August session is going to be a fantastic one around governing agility, which is a new book and based on work by Tony Ponton and Phil Kadinsky, who we both know. And Tony's been on, spoke with us before at least once. And it's an excellent book because it's all about how to apply agility to your governance practices. So it should be relevant to many in your organizations because a number of us, and I talked about this earlier, do suffer a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of silo working, and a lot of governance practices which just slow everybody down. So the new book that Tony and Phil have written is an excellent look at an exploration of that topic. If that's of interest to you or anybody you know, make them aware of it so they can sign up and enjoy the session because it should be a great one. So that's in August. And in September, we've got a session lined up to BC around neuroscience. Again, a lot of stuff that we're interested here. how to understand neuroscience for positive adaptation to change. So they're in Meetup. If you're new to the group, you'll find us there. Sign up, and thank you again for joining us today. It's been great, and we look forward to seeing you again. And have a great remainder of the day, whatever time of the day it happens to be for you. And we hope we will see you. So look after yourselves, and thanks for joining us. And thanks again, Nia, for a fantastic
Thank
session.
you.
Really.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Totally
everyone.
enjoyed it.
See you again. Thanks.